There's the voice. How are you? Wonderful to see you. I've been quoting you today.
I told him you told the
And
story.
don't correct me when I say where it took place.
Yes, sir.
Let's start with that.
I'll begin by asking you all not to worry about my eyesight. I have more vision than the President of the United States.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote. That, and I quote him, training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive. And that if it were otherwise, Mr. Gromyko went on, the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance, unquote. That statement also was false. Acting, therefore, in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved.
Well, tonight we have the great opportunity to have a conversation with the, he wouldn't describe it this way, but I would, the principal draftsman of that speech and so many more, Ted Sorensen. And what we're going to try to do tonight is recall an event that historians identify as the single most serious moment in human history. 45 years ago this week, literally this week, 45 years ago, President John F. Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev stood eyeball to eyeball, as it was said, each with nuclear arsenals in hand, indeed, one hair trigger. The odds that the crisis would lead to war were estimated by President Kennedy as between 1 in 3 and even. And as a historian who's studied this event, and I think most of the historians who've analyzed it, have no reason to disagree with the president's estimate. had the confrontation ended in a nuclear war, that could have caused the sudden death of more than 100 million people. So to help us recall those 13 days and to reflect on lessons that we might take from those days and the diplomacy in those events for policy challenges today, we've got the extraordinary good fortune to have with us as our guests one of the major players in this crisis, the president's closest confidant other than his brother Bobby, and his speechwriter, Ted Sorensen. So it's a great pleasure to have Ted here. In the handout...
You forgot to mention that 5 years ago this week, my wife and I were fellows at the Institute of Politics. And despite the wonderful addition of Jim Leach as director, I can see from the movie that the high tech is no good here anymore.
A fair point. In fact, the buzzing, I don't know how we managed to incorporate, but we should apologize for and do, because that was not part of the original, you can be sure. Ted's bio is in the handout. He's from Nebraska. He once said, that's a good place to be from. He joined John Kennedy's staff in the Senate and then went with him to the White House as special counsel and principal speechwriter. In addition, our new IOP director, Jim Leach, who's just become director of the IOP after 15 terms in Congress from Iowa, will help in provoking or cross-examining or otherwise questioning Ted as we try to have a conversation here. And then by the time we get to the end, there'll be opportunities for questions from the audience. So this will be a little bit of a little bit of Kennedy in the flesh, or at least on film, recollections from a person who worked closely with him every day. And then we're even going to look at a clip from a forum that was done here 5 years ago when Ted and Gillian were fellows here with Bob McNamara on what was the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But let me start by putting the thing in context. So many people here were not born or were not conscious during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, that's not very surprising. Many people here who are students' parents were not born or were not conscious during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I told Ted this morning, we were out doing an event at the library, that a Harvard student asked me last night at the forum event with Itamar Rabinovich, said, I'm very interested in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I've been studying the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I was just wondering, did this happen before or after the Second World War? So this happened after the Second World War. Okay? After this, there was something called the Cold War. There's a long story there. There was a country called the Soviet Union. You can't find that on your maps today. The Soviet Union and the United States were locked in a battle between communist expansion and the free world, as it was thought. And many, many people thought the conclusion of this was almost certain to be a nuclear Armageddon. There was a Godkin lecturer here at Harvard, C.P. Snow, who explained that scientists knew things that other people didn't know, and he, as a scientist, explained that it was, quote, a mathematical certainty that the conclusion of this Cold War would be a nuclear war. I mentioned to Ted earlier today, those of you just here for the local Harvard community who paid attention last week for a historic event, namely the inauguration of a new Harvard president, Drew Faust. If you listen to her remarks, she had a terrific inaugural address, but the part that I like the best goes like this. She says, last week, I was given a brown manila envelope that had been entrusted to the university archives in 1951 by James B. Conant, Harvard's 23rd president. He left instructions that it should be opened by the Harvard president at the outset of the next century and not before. I broke the seal and so forth. And it says, quote, "My dear sir." Surprise. Okay. But he goes on to convey his sense of imminent nuclear danger, in which he says he fears an impending World War III that would make the destruction of our cities, including Cambridge, possible. He then says we all wonder how the free world is going to get through the next 50 years. But he asks, if the prophets of doom are proved wrong, and there is a Harvard president to receive this manila envelope, that they take the following instructions. So Ted, the question I wanted to get you to start on is, this far away from 1951, President Conant's sense of imminent nuclear danger, maybe Cambridge would disappear, is not, I think, what's on the minds of most students or most faculty members. In the missile crisis, to take just that specifically, 1 in 3 an even chance of war, or some very substantial chance of war. How real was this as a risk as you felt it? I mean, did you think, maybe Washington is going away, maybe my house is going away, maybe my family is going away, maybe this is my last Saturday?
Graham, thanks very much. Let me say several things. First of all, I disagree with you that nuclear danger has gone away.
No, I don't say it's gone away. I say it's not in people's consciousness to the extent that Conant.
Perhaps it should be. And I noticed in the newspapers that Ms. Faust, in her inaugural address, said a university should focus not simply on the present, but on the past. And the lessons from the Cuban Missile Crisis in that regard are extremely important. President Kennedy proved that he was a man of peace and that he was determined to find a peaceful solution to the most dangerous crisis. As you point out, historians have called it the most dangerous 13 days in the history of mankind. And on the final night, as we will come to, when the ex-com was still meeting and there were some dramatic exchanges that I don't believe have been revealed, but they will be in my book when it comes out in May. The president was actually back in the Oval Office trying one last-ditch attempt to find a peaceful solution, working through Secretary General Uttant of the United Nations, because he believed in the United Nations and made certain that our response to the Soviet missiles was consistent with the United Nations Charter and with international law. The fact that he was willing during that last day, which I have a feeling you're going to ask me about, he was willing to communicate with our adversaries, which is totally against conventional thinking, even in the Democratic Party today, I notice, and to, in effect, negotiate through that correspondence was largely responsible for the fact that you and I and all of us are here today. Had he instead followed the recommendations of General LeMay and most of the Joint Chiefs, not Max Taylor, I hasten to add, he was a wonderful military leader. Had the president followed their insistence that he bomb the missile sites and almost every other site in Cuba and follow it up with an invasion, as one of them said, go in there and take Cuba away from Castro. We didn't know at the time, but we learned later that the Soviet forces on Cuba, which had been substantially augmented, had tactical nuclear weapons and had authority to use them if there was any attack by the Americans. Had they attacked with tactical nuclear weapons under the so-called rules of engagement in that MAD, M-A-D, mutual assured destruction era, The United States would have responded with probably tactical nuclear weapons. The Soviets would have responded to that with strategic nuclear weapons. We would have continued up that ladder of escalation until there was nothing left of either country. And when nuclear fallout, radiation is carried by wind and water throughout the world, this might have become one of those planets that astronomers tell us over the eons have been extinguished. Might have extinguished the whole planet. People often ask me, how scared was I? Well, I was working too hard to feel scared. We knew as we met around that table day and night during those 13 days that the cabinet room was not, as I'm told it is today, a reinforced concrete bunker, so that if the Soviets had missiles, guided missiles as accurate as ours, we would not have been there much longer. Things had gone the wrong way when I was drafting the letter to Khrushchev, a letter which seemed almost futile because nothing else had worked. I knew that if I provoked him, angered him, whatever, his response would be too horrible to imagine. But I will conclude this overly long answer by saying when I speak on this sometimes around the country, men about your age come up to me afterwards and thank me for making President Kennedy's speech to the country on the evening of October 22nd so scary because it enabled them to convince their girlfriends it was the last night on earth.
I should probably let that pass, but I'll say, I had just arrived in Oxford, having graduated from Harvard the summer before, and there as a Marshall Scholar. I had arrived 10 days before the missile crisis began, and I do say that was a good line. Yeah. The 5 years ago, we celebrated here on this stage in the forum the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we had, as was mentioned earlier, Ted and Bob McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense during the crisis, and a wonderful conversation between the two, which is on the Institute of Politics Forum website, where you can go back and see all of the forum events, including this one. But in that exchange, there was a difference between a view between Ted Sorensen and Bob McNamara about the degree of luck or absence of luck in the outcome, that is, getting to the end without nuclear war. Let's see if we can see that clip, and then Jim Leach is going to pursue this line of argument.
In Cuba, just last Friday and Saturday, the former deputy foreign minister and the former deputy director of the KGB said, well, had we attacked, the nuclear weapons would be used. We call that, talk about that later. But they also said that in any event, which we were telling the president at the time, and he himself expressed at the time, the Soviets would have to respond. We thought there were 10,000 Soviet troops. It turned out there were 40,000 there. If we'd killed 40,000 Soviet troops and 100,000 or so Cubans, my God, the Soviets wouldn't have done nothing. So the deputy foreign minister and deputy director of KGB said, yes, we would have attacked Berlin, and we would have been at war. We came that close to nuclear war, and although it was well managed by President Kennedy, in the end, we lucked out.
Well, Ted, probably the greatest political science quote of the 20th century, maybe ever, Einstein said that splitting the atom had changed everything except our way of thinking. And as we look back on this, it seems like we're in a process of changing our way of thinking, led by you and President Kennedy. And the question that as I looked at that last set of comments a few weeks ago, I really wondered, was this wonderful diplomacy? Was it luck? Was it a supreme being that might have intervened? How do you see this as you go through these 13 days and come up with this extraordinary set of exchanges with the Soviets that they then, in effect, capitulated on?
Well, I'm not an expert on the Supreme Being. I must say, a couple weeks ago when I noticed that our current president's chief speechwriter said that our current president's words were guided by God, I thought it's quite a heavy burden to put on the Almighty to think that the Almighty said we're really kicking ass in Iraq. In any event, I think that the proof is in the pudding. The fact that Kennedy chose not the airstrike and invasion, but the restrained, but nevertheless clear message of the blockade. The fact that he directed me, with supervision from Bobby, to write an answer to Khrushchev's letter of Friday evening, October 26, and to find in his letter, amidst all the threats and denials, the seeds of a deal, and pretty much ignore the October 27 harsh letter. All that was superb diplomatic leadership on his part. At the end of the crisis, he received a handwritten note from our senior diplomatic statesman, Dean Acheson, former Secretary of State, congratulating him on his superb handling of the crisis. Interesting, because during that first week, Dean Acheson was brought in as an outside advisor to our little group. I remember it very, very well. He was the expert, and he favored the airstrike. And I'm sitting here on the front of the table, Acheson is there, and a voice comes from behind the table. I think it was General Maxwell Taylor. He said, "What will the Soviets do when we strike?" And Acheson said, "I know the Soviets very well. They will feel obligated to, if we hit their missiles, to strike on Allied territory of theirs, Cuba. They will feel obligated to attack our missiles, or NATO's missiles, on Allied territory in Turkey." And Max asked, "Then what do we do?" "Well," he said, "under the NATO convention, we'll be obligated to attack Soviet missiles inside Soviet territory." Questioned again, "Well, then what will they do?" Long pause. Acheson said, "Well, by then we hope things will cool off." And a few years, maybe 10 at most, after it was all over, former Secretary Acheson was either writing or an article for or interviewed by Esquire magazine, where he said, just somewhat disdainfully, the Kennedys, meaning Jack and Robert, the Kennedys succeeded in the Cuban Missile Crisis only through luck. And I was called up by a newspaper man who said, "Do you agree with that?" And I paused for a moment and I said, "Yes, the Kennedys were lucky in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Lucky they didn't take Dean Acheson's advice."
We have another clip that's about a great speech that President Kennedy gave many months later at American University, and we're going to do a bit more from it, and I'd like you all to look at it.
We must therefore persevere in the search for peace in the hope that constructive changes within the communist bloc might bring within reach solutions which now seem beyond us. We must conduct our affairs in such a way that it becomes in the communist interest to agree on a genuine peace, and above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world.
So Ted, let me get you to talk a little bit about whether there's some lessons from this takeaway from the missile crisis, because you've talked earlier about the line between the Cuban Missile Crisis and the American University speech. And I'd like you to extend the line further to events today, for example, Iran. So if you go from Cuban Missile Crisis to what Kennedy is saying he learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis and wants to apply, would it provide some clues about Iran today?
I think so. And that's a very, very interesting and good question, Graham. You heard the president, when I used it for all these years, when I say the president, I'm talking about John F. Kennedy. You heard the president say about we must not force an adversary into a choice between a humiliating retreat and nuclear war. And that is a description of why he chose the blockade, put the ball in Khrushchev's court instead of bombing him and giving him no real choice. And in that same speech, he also said, the world knows America will never start a war. This generation of Americans has seen enough of war. He was talking about himself. He had served valiantly in World War II and lost two of his best friends. He had seen enough of war, and he was determined not to have another one. Times change, presidents change. I also mentioned this morning that because he not only reached out to the United Nations, he reached out to our allies and sent high-level statesmen to brief the British Prime Minister, the German Chancellor, and the most obstinate of all, the President of France, Charles de Gaulle. And we sent Dean Acheson as our most senior statesman for that difficult job of briefing and convincing de Gaulle. And he presented to de Gaulle the arguments that were set forth in that speech of October 22nd. And then he said to him, Mr. President, out in your waiting room is an U.S. Air Force colonel who has the pictures. We were sharing the evidence of weapons of mass destruction that somehow couldn't be found in Iraq. And he will come in here, and with a pointer, he will show you exactly why we know those weapons are there and what they consist of and what they can do. And de Gaulle waved him off. He said, no, the word of the President of the United States is enough for me. Times change.
Ted, in the compromise that evolved, we had a circumstance where we indicated that we would take missiles out of Turkey, and we also indicated we'd respect, as I understand it, Cuban sovereignty. But we also indicated we were going to keep this secret. Several generations earlier, there was an argument about open covenants openly arrived at. Here we had kind of a secret arrangement. Can you tell us the chemistry of the time that made it so important that these issues be kept secret?
I think to put that in context, one must realize the whole foundation of the so-called Cold War. Our allies, Western Europe, Japan, and others, clearly depended not only on the power and might of the United States, but on our willingness to use it. The saying in that time was, the Americans must be willing to sacrifice their cities in order to protect, meaning deter, a Soviet attack on European cities. They had to trust us, that we would not back down. And now, when that second letter from Khrushchev said, we're not taking anything out of Cuba unless you take out the NATO missiles in Turkey, we had to make a very difficult choice. As President Kennedy said, history is going to regard that as a rather reasonable offer on his part. But at the same time, he knew that if the United States undermined NATO and specifically Turkey by removing those missiles because a gun was pointed at our head, who would ever believe in the future that the United States would risk its cities to protect the cities of others? And so Bobby took the letter that had been drafted to see Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin, and he accompanied the letter with 2 oral messages, one of which was, the Hawks are rising. They're going to be demanding airstrikes and invasion. The president, of course, is in control of the government, but one never knows what can happen. The second oral message, and therefore he said, we're in this letter agreeing to the propositions contained, at least as I interpreted them, in Khrushchev's letter of Friday. So we better reach agreement in a hurry. The other oral message was, the president had long ago felt that the NATO missiles in Turkey, American-built, were anachronistic, unreliable, not as modern and powerful. What he didn't say was we were actually going to shift that deterrent to underwater Polaris nuclear submarines in the Mediterranean, where they would not be visible the way those NATO missiles could be seen by Russian vacationers at the Black Sea, insulting and humiliating. But so we said to Dobrynin, if it's any satisfaction to Chairman Khrushchev, we're not going to make a deal on this. We're not going to make a public quid pro quo. But I can quietly assure you those missiles will be gone in a few months. And they were.
We have one last clip towards the end of the speech at American University that is one of extraordinary import as well as extraordinary English craftsmanship. Maybe we could see this one too.
The United States, as the world knows, will never start a war. We do not want a war. We do not now expect a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression. We shall be prepared if others wish it. We shall be alert to try to stop it. But we shall also do our part to build a world of peace where the weak are safe and the strong are just. We are not helpless before that task or hopeless of its success. Confident and unafraid, we must labor on, not towards a strategy of annihilation, but towards a strategy of peace.
Before opening this to questions, I want to make one comment and ask Ted one brief question. And the comment is, presidencies are incredibly lonely offices. And I think we can all be proud that this president had an extraordinary friend as well as advisor. And earlier this evening, Ted quoted his favorite line from the speech that we didn't put on the stage. And I'd like to ask Ted if you would, in your words, repeat this quote. They were your words.
I don't remember the line that precedes it, in which he talks about acknowledging our differences, and then said, but in the final analysis, I'm sorry, it almost makes me weep to quote this. In the final analysis, we all inhabit the same planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. 6 months later, he was dead.
We thank you, Ted. A brilliant, for anybody who hasn't reread the American University speech, it's every paragraph in it is stunning. Ted, let me pick up just one other point on this. There was once said about Churchill that he mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. That may not be exactly the right quote. Whenever I get tired walking in my office, I go out and walk around the JFK Park here in the front yard. And I would recommend that to all of you. In the fountain, which is the memorial element, and at every corner to the walkway, there are a set of splendid quotations from John F. Kennedy. And actually, Kitty Galbraith, who's here tonight, and her husband, John Kenneth Galbraith, and I, consulting with the person who was probably the draftsman of almost all these lines, selected them. Everywhere one goes. So what, if you here, people are students at Harvard. They are interested in government. How important is writing relative to other skills that they could have?
Well, believe me, in those days, it was nice to have a president of the United States who clearly spoke the English language.
We're going to open this to questions.
For questions, if you would stand up, we have 4 microphones here, 2 on the ground floor and 2 on the loges. And this gentleman I saw first, so introduce yourself, a short question, and we'll ask Ted to answer.
John Marigus, 3 related questions to Cuban, but I want to echo your suggestion to go out and see those quotes. They're not only good, the ones there, but also at the Kennedy Library, and they inspire me as they do you. And so that's a good segue. Thank you, Mr. Sorensen, for your contribution to those words. And thank you for coming tonight. In light of Cuba Missile Crisis, the 13 days, there were 3 questions related. One was regarding information. And one of them brings me to the question that you may, since you almost became CIA director, what would you do looking at the recommendations in the post 9/11, the reshuffling, we'll call it, of CIA and DCI and the role there, and how does that impinge good information that you would, in Cuban Missile Crisis or today your president would use? Second, what do you think of nuclear non-proliferation, particularly the issues regarding Pakistan and India?
We should probably do just one question,
Okay,
a customer
and then Iran. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, good. How
Well,
about
if I
intelligence?
if I heard the question correctly, let me first say that number one, I've never been a great believer that serious substantive government problems are solved by reorganizations or adding additional lines of bureaucracy. I will say that for all the criticisms it's received, the CIA deserves some credit for the fact that we were alerted to the missiles in Cuba. The U-2 plane was an extraordinary instrument of science that could take films 50,000 miles up and determine feet. Oh, sorry. Shows you I've been away from government for a long time. 50,000 feet up, and supposedly those pictures were sharp enough to tell whether a picnic table had a tablecloth on it or not. And not only the U-2 plane, but the genius of the photo analysts and photo interpreters at the CIA, who were able during that weekend before Tuesday the 16th to study those films and recognize, based on a comparison of, I suppose, pictures of missiles being hauled through Red Square on May Day and so on, that these were the beginnings of missile sites. Now, information in that sense was very good, and yet communication in terms of information was very poor. Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin, at one of the reunions that I think Graham mentioned already, didn't you? Who would have believed 45 years ago today that someday Americans, Soviets, and Cubans who had participated in this unbelievably dangerous period would meet from time to time, and we did meet. And in one of them, Dobrynin told about how the Soviets handled American messages, including presidential statements and speeches. In the Soviet embassy on 16th Street, as I recall, they would code. Well, they would translate it into Russian, put the Russian into code, and they would call up Western Union. There are probably a few people here who remember Western Union, who would send out a young man on a bicycle. He would come and they would hand him the message. He would pedal back to Western Union. They would send it to Western Union Moscow, who would send it on a bicycle to the Kremlin and Mr. Khrushchev. All this taking an enormous amount of time. And Dobrynin added, we hoped the young man didn't have a girlfriend in our neighborhood. So that is why one of the immediate lessons of the missile crisis was the establishment of a hotline, as it was called, between the Kremlin. People thought it was into the White House, but it was actually between the Kremlin and the Pentagon for use in the event of some kind of emergency, to make certain that accidental warfare never broke out because of a misunderstanding or miscommunication. There was even one such incident during the 13 days. It was on that very Saturday when we had all the bad news. I told you it looked like we were losing on the diplomatic track with the second letter, losing on the information track because one of our U-2s was shot down, and the chiefs insisted that we retaliate by bombing the Soviet SAM site that shot it down. Everything was just on the edge of breaking into war when a message came in that a U.S. Air Force plane, I think based in Alaska, had been sent out on an air sampling mission in order to test the air to find out if the Soviets were testing their nuclear weapons. Truth of the matter is, we were testing our nuclear weapons. And this Air Force plane, flying over the pole, hard to get lost, there's only one direction to go from the North Pole, but his navigation controls malfunctioned, and he flew out over Siberia. A U.S. Air Force plane flying out over Soviet territory. This was read aloud in XCOM, and there was stunned silence until the president, never losing his sense of humor, broke the silence saying, there's always one son of a bitch who doesn't get the message. That's when the hotline would have been useful.
Just a footnote, actually, the camera for the U-2 was created here in Cambridge by Edwin Land, a Polaroid Land camera, and there's a Land classroom over here in the next building. So go ahead.
One of his friends, Carl Kaysen, sitting right here.
Yes, absolutely, a close friend. Please, introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Vivek. I'm a junior student at Harvard College. I wanted to ask, just because there's been so much talk about experience in this presidential campaign, President Kennedy was just, I guess, 45 years old when all these events were occurring. And what do you think it was in his life experience and character development that enabled him to pursue such a peaceful course? And extending that to today, when we are evaluating the candidates and deciding who to vote for, how can we evaluate whether in a crisis like this they'd show the same level of judgment and foresight?
I promise you I didn't plant this question.
It's a good
I think-
question, and it's,
I
the
think there
two
are at least-
pieces work together, so I let you get away with 1.5. Yes.
Well, I didn't hear the half, but let me just say there are at least 3 elements that I think in President Kennedy's background that helped. One was, as you heard in his American University commencement, he was truly a man of peace. That came both from his religious upbringing and from the fact that he had seen enough of war and lost 2 of his best friends in that war. And that's why in the current presidential campaign, I'm supporting the candidate who opposed the Iraq invasion before it started. Secondly, President Kennedy had lived abroad when his father was ambassador and extensively traveled abroad. As far as I know, there's only one candidate for president in the Democratic sweepstakes this year who's lived abroad substantially. Third is the fact that President Kennedy believed in communication and negotiations. He demonstrated that in the letter that he asked me to write on that penultimate day of the crisis. And I frankly cannot understand why we have candidates who say, oh no, we mustn't meet with leaders of Iran or Syria. They're bad people. Communication is essential. Kennedy believed in communication, and that's one of the reasons we're all still here today talking.
This gentleman, please.
Hi, my name is Nick Zimmerman. I'm a 2nd-year public policy student here at the Kennedy School. My question does not directly refer to the Cuban Missile Crisis and rather speech writing. In addition to being a student here, I'm working on the Senate campaign and have begun to start writing speeches. I was hoping that you could talk a bit about your writing process in these years. Clearly, in an event like the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's no time for writer's block, and I was wondering where you looked for inspiration and how you were consistently able to deliver on what was an unbelievable responsibility at the time.
Well, thanks. All this will be in my book when it comes out in the spring.
Just in case you didn't notice, there's a book coming in May. It actually has a mystery title, but he's going to come back.
In terms of the main subject of this forum, imagine the president turning the writing of that particular letter over to somebody who was 34 years old. It's outrageous to entrust that draft of that document to someone that young. Is scary when I think about it. But who knows? He and I thought alike. We had spent 4 years from the 56th convention to the 60th convention traveling all 50 states together. You get to know somebody pretty well when you do all that traveling, and you get to know what works and what doesn't work in his speaking style when you sit day after day listening to him speak on all kinds of issues. So pretty soon our thoughts and our styles merged. The speech of October 22nd, like the commencement at American University, were great speeches. It's nice of Jim to talk about wordcraft, but they were actually great speeches because of the policies and principles and decisions which they conveyed, and those were John F. Kennedy's, not mine.
The gentleman here, please.
My name is Carlos Bortoni, and I'm a freshman at Harvard College. Mr. Sorensen, you brought a lot the issue of communication and how important this is, both in diplomacy and how you make national policy. How were you able, and what were the difficulties of scheming through the rhetoric and knowing what were the essence of the Russian and also of the American speeches, and how this guided policy that were to be taken?
Sorry, can somebody translate that for me?
What he meant was, when you read other speeches, how do you get away from the flourishes and rhetoric right to the point that matters? And is this something that you cultivated in your life, and how do you do that, was what he was saying.
Well,
Both in reading their speeches and in presenting your own.
well, I mean, how did I do it? I've had an extremely lucky life, and it began by brilliant choice of parents. My mother was an amateur writer and editor. My father was a reform lawyer like Jim Leach. He was
I'm not an attorney, sir.
a liberal Republican at that time, a reform attorney general. And I grew up in a family of big talkers, and in order to get a word in at the table, I had to be pretty sharp. And my older brothers and I, and later on my sister, we were all on the debate team in high school and in college. When I was here as a fellow at the IOP 5 years ago, I devoted one of my seminars to this same question. I said, start out with an outline, figure out what's your headline, decide on your front line, throw in a few sidelines like poems and historical anecdotes, and have a strong bottom line with which to conclude. So it's just a few lines.
Please.
Hi. Mr. Sorensen, hi. I'm Danielle Giuliano. I'm studying conflict management here. There's much to learn about the process, the decision-making process that was employed in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Can you comment about the process in general, and in particular, if there's anything that you would like to see, you doing it a second time would have seen improved?
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing
The
very well.
question relates to one of process, and she says, as you look back on these 13 days, is there an aspect of process that you would have thought should be done differently as this crisis developed?
No, I would say the process worked pretty well. Did I mention, and I've spoken so many times today, they're all beginning to blur which points I've made, but in terms of who was in that meeting, that first meeting, the president did not call together the National Security Council. Congress had enacted a statute saying who should be called together, and everybody of any importance or self-importance, which is everyone, in Washington always thought he should participate in a National Security Council decision. And to show how important he was, he would bring along his deputy. And the deputy, of course, to show he was important, had to bring along an assistant. And pretty soon you have a meeting so large, too large, to make the kind of crisp decision John F. Kennedy made, and too large to keep a secret. And he felt it was extremely important to keep secret the fact which the Russians did not know, which is that we knew what they were doing. He felt that would give us at least a week or 10 days till it leaked out that we knew, so that we could formulate our response without the Russians taking some new preemptive step, or the Congress some foolish demand, or the public or the press or others. So that's one variation from the usual process. He simply called together the dozen or so people whose recommendations he wanted and trusted.
See, I think I skipped you, so we'll come back up here to the loge, please.
Thanks, sir. Hey, Mr. Sorensen, first, thank you very much for coming and speaking to us tonight, but more importantly, thank you for your service to the nation back in the 60s. Obviously, great input at a critical time. My name is Gordon Armfield. I'm a fellow at the National Security Program here at the Kennedy School, and what I wanted to ask you was how much of the president's experience with the Bay of Pigs influenced his decision-making when it came to his second Cuban crisis during the missile crisis?
Say it again.
His question is, how much does his experience with the Bay of Pigs influence his decision-making?
No, that's an excellent question. The Bay of Pigs was JFK's biggest fiasco, his first stumble. He cursed himself for having given it the green light to go ahead. It was a plan that was cooked up by the CIA and with others who were holdovers from the previous administration. He never did it again. He changed people in charge of the CIA, he changed the Joint Chiefs of Staff, changed some of his political State Department people as well. But he also changed the procedural approach. Just to be a little immodest about it, but if I can't be immodest at the Kennedy School, where can I be immodest? He asked Bobby and me to sit in on meetings thereafter because he knew we looked at issues the way he looked at issues and not through the eyes of a particular department or agency. And he made certain at the Cuban Missile Crisis, as he did not at the Bay of Pigs, that he examined all the options and the pros and cons of all those options.
So this gentleman, and one question per customer. Please, sir, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Lee Mintz. I'm a former research fellow here in the school. The one thing that's always troubled me about the Cuban Missile Crisis is the meeting with Gromyko shortly before the public display of our knowledge of what the Russians or the Soviets were actually up to in Cuba. It has always seemed to me puzzling why the president did not, with Gromyko in his office at that time, simply directly, then and there, offer the swap of our obsolete missiles in Turkey, which I think we had already tried to get rid of 4 separate times prior to the Cuban Missile Crisis, right then and there, privately, secretly, offering to Gromyko, an enormously powerful man in the Soviet hierarchy at that time, the direct swap. We see what you're doing in Cuba. We know you're claiming it's merely defensive. Here's the offer. Our missiles out of Turkey, your incoming missiles out of Cuba. Nobody knows a thing about it. We tell the members of the Turkish government, these are obsolete. We're going to have Polaris missiles protecting all of the Mediterranean theater. Why did that not happen?
Well, that's an extremely interesting and thoughtful question and quite a constructive idea. If only you had been there instead of that 34-year-old who had no experience.
Thank you very much, sir.
So,
as I say, I've just always been puzzled by it since childhood.
Well, bear in mind that Gromyko was only a mouthpiece. When we first heard that he wanted to come to the White House, we feared the worst. It was right in the middle of our first week of deliberations. We thought he was probably coming to commence nuclear blackmail by telling us. So the president gave him every opportunity by asking questions about what was going on. And Gromyko, who probably, but not necessarily, knew about the missiles in Cuba. Dobrynin did not know at that time.
Well, I've overstayed my welcome, I understand that, but it's my reading of what historians of that period in the Soviet Union, the Politburo, and the Supreme Soviet have written, that Gromyko was perhaps, next to Khrushchev, the single most powerful man in the Soviet hierarchy at that time. Apparently that was not the reading of the president at that moment, but historians seem to have suggested as much.
Khrushchev, to our reading, was pretty much a one-man show. Mikoyan was his number 2. Gromyko was a voice in the UN and in some foreign meetings, but I don't think I would describe him as the second most powerful man in the Soviet Union.
we have time just for 2 more short questions and short answers, and this lady's.
Hi, my name's Sarah Monahan, and I wanted to know, given the activism of the 60s that President Kennedy inspired much of, do you find that the activism of today is the appropriate response given the offenses of the last 7 years' administration? Do you think that people are actually responding to the offensiveness of this administration like they responded positively during President Kennedy's?
Again, I'm sorry, I'm not hearing well enough to
I
understand.
think she's asking a question about the response of the American people.
Do you think people are actually responding? There's activism, there's a public outcry, there's participation in what's going on in the last seven years during this administration, like there was in the 60s.
She's suggesting that the American people were quite politically organized to respond to presidential decision-making in the 60s, which they do not, in her judgment, appear to be responding in recent years. Do you see a correlation or a contrast?
Well, it's, I think, no, thanks, Jim. Well, that's very thoughtful. It was Kennedy who, in his inaugural address, called upon all of the American people to participate. That's what Ask Not was all about. And I've been told so many times that many of the movements which began, even though they weren't specifically mentioned in the address, the civil rights movement barely, consumer movement, women's rights, etc., not at all, and yet activists felt that the new, young, active, idealistic president was calling to them to take an interest and get involved. In those days, people set their schedules so that they could watch a presidential news conference. Every 2 weeks there was a presidential news conference, and they were informative and they were inspiring, and if I may say so, I think the president's speeches, whether on television or around the country, drew the people in. He trusted the people, he informed them, and I might also add, when I was a kid growing up, we were at war. Everybody knew it and felt it. Taxes were raised, not reduced. Gasoline was rationed instead of selling more and more gas guzzlers. Kids like me and my brothers and sister were asked to collect scrap and rubber and grow what we were told were victory gardens. It was a country that was sacrificing and contributing, and I've seen, and that was all stemming from the leadership of Franklin D. Roosevelt. I've seen none of that in these last 7 years.
Last question, please.
Thank you. Sir, my name is Hector Hernandez. I'm a special agent with the U.S. Secret Service, and so my question is a little bit on the selfish side. I was also assigned to the Dallas field office. I've been assigned under 2 presidents at the White House, and I've served them both to the best of my abilities, and I was there during the 9/11 attacks. And so I understand the atmosphere, what was going on at the White House during this time. So I'm curious, what was the atmosphere like for the Secret Service agents and also for the White House staff during your time, during those 13 days of difficulty?
Well, Agent, you probably won't like my answer. The agents obviously did as best they could, but in the end they failed, didn't they? The president was killed. Some agents have sold secret information to book publishers, which I think is outrageous, and I hope will never be repeated. But theirs is a difficult and dangerous job. The president got along well with his agents, and I knew and respected them in their work, and I certainly am thankful to you for yours. But in any profession, including the law profession, which I've served all these years, and the medical profession, even the teaching profession, there are some successes and some failures. And So if I take a somewhat sour view when I think back, I hope you'll understand and forgive me. I have to tell you a true story. Just a week or 2 weeks ago, I was traveling with a candidate who has Secret Service now, Obama. We were going from Des Moines to Jim Leach's old grounds, the Iowa City area. Pretty good drive. There were several cars in a motorcade. And we were trying to catch up because, like all candidates, he was behind schedule, and there was a very large audience waiting for him. And it began to rain, and it rained. I'm the worst possible judge how hard it's raining because I can't see very well. But we were going through a rainstorm such as I have never seen, and nobody could see very well. And yet we were going faster and faster and faster, up to 80 miles an hour. And then word came over the radio that we were driving through a tornado. When we finally reached the outskirts of Iowa City, I saw those two agents and I chastised them a little bit. They didn't like it, but I said, your job is to protect the candidate's life. And all of us were risking our lives back there. You should have told them to pull over to the side of the road and wait till the storm was gone. But they have a difficult job, and I know that, and I wouldn't want to trade jobs with them, but God bless those of you who are doing it. Thank you.
As we come to the closing here, I wanted to recognize that we have Carl Kazin in the front row. Carl is an emeritus professor at MIT and at Harvard, but also served with Ted in the White House under President Kennedy at this time. And maybe, Ted, if you tell the short version of the Kazin story, which you were telling today, but Carl wasn't here.
I really must. I really must. The missile crisis, I've been talking to you about the bad news and the letters and the Brennan messages and all the rest on Saturday the 27th. And as you know, it all amazingly ended on Sunday morning the 28th. The President and I were, according to my memory, standing outside the cabinet room where the ex-com was about to have its last meeting, the first one in which, when the President entered, moments later, they all stood up and applauded. And while he and I were standing there talking, Carl came up. Earlier in the 13 days, there had been an outbreak of a border war between China and India. We thought maybe this is part of a worldwide conspiracy. Who knows? So Carl came up and he said, Mr. Carl, because Bundy had been assigned full-time to the missile crisis, Carl had been in charge of the rest of the world during those 13 days. And he came up and said, Mr. President, now is the time that you can settle the India-China border war. And JFK said, I don't think either one of them would be interested in hearing from me. And Carl said, but Mr. President, today you're 10 feet tall. And the President said, that'll last a couple of weeks. It's lasted 45 years, and here we are.
So let's say thank you very much to Ted Sorensen for a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
If we're lucky, when Ted's book is published in early May, he'll be back to tell us about the book. But you'll have to hold your breath to then.
Thank you.